All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with John Dominic Crossan. And today we're going to be answering questions about Josephus and Paul and two very different ways of being a Pharisee in their historical context and just how they had contrasting views of empire and such. If you want to find Dom's lecture along with four other ones looking at Paul, then head over to crossanclass.com. And if you've already joined, you've sent in some amazing questions, quite a few of them. So we're going to try to be quick and get through as many as we can today, Dom. How are you feeling?
Yes, that's what we're trying to do. I'll be fast because they are good questions.
All right. Well, the first question today comes from Sarah. She said, "You describe Paul as a radical rather than a liberal. Could you clarify what you mean by these terms and whether this distinction matters for understanding Paul's message?"
Well, yes to the second part, Sarah, but it comes from the Latin word radix, which simply means a root. A radical is somebody who is not tearing everything up by the roots, but thinks that the solution to our problems is not on the surface, but in the roots. And that's what I think is right. When Paul says a new creation, I cannot even imagine anything more radical than trying to imagine a new creation. So if you take Paul seriously and think he's not just, let's scare the daylights out of the Corinthians or somebody by saying a new creation. What if he actually meant it? That's a radical problem for our humanity and for our evolution and everything else. So I think liberals will fix up the surface. And in the meanwhile, the liberals are very good at band-aids. Now, let me be quite blunt. Conservatives are worse. But it seems to me that we have problems in the world now, as in the first century, that requires radical solutions. And I do not equate radical with violent. I don't. If you do, you've lost the struggle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the lecture itself, you're looking at the difference between Josephus and Paul, and there Michael asks, why is comparing Paul with Josephus particularly illuminating? What advantages does this comparison offer other approaches to understanding Paul?
Well, the biggest thing is that we have two Pharisees. I mean, by any way that I can understand language, Josephus is a Pharisee. He says he runs his life according to the creeds of the Pharisees. Okay, he's a Pharisee. Maybe he doesn't say it exactly the same way as Paul does. But we have two Pharisees, and we have their own writing in the first century. Okay, it seems to me obvious to try and look at the two of them, simply because they're in the same matrix and the same choice. So basically looking at, first of all, Paul, then looking at Josephus and seeing how they interact with one another. And it's hard in terms of empire now. I'm not just talking about other things, but in terms of empire, absolutely, Josephus is on the side of empire because his argument is simply that God's on the side of empire. Not a stupid, not a stupid argument. Neither is it what, of course, Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7 says, nor what the Torah says, nor what the prophets say, nor what the wisdom tradition says. So yeah, he's pretty much outside his Jewish matrix when he declares that God's on the side of empire. And in fact, he goes worse than that. He says God is on the side of might.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Part of the one of the things that you've done throughout the lectures, both here with Josephus and thinking back to Thecla, and then looking at Luke, Acts, and trying to understand and locate Paul within his contemporaries, you've kind of shown how there's this constant argument going on, one of which shows up in the broader historical tradition, some in the text. And that's where Rebecca asks the question, you suggest that the fierce polemic against the Pharisees in the New Testament represents a fight for the center. Could you elaborate on what you mean by this and how it helps us understand the early Christian text?
Yeah, as a vast simplicity, maybe, Rebecca, the way I look at the data is that, using this terminology, the conservatives in the first century are the Sadducees. They're perfectly happy with the status quo. everything is good. I think that's the conservative viewpoint. I think the what would I say, the radical viewpoint might be those people, the Qumrans down at Ephesus. What am I talking about? At the Essenes down at Qumran, sorry. Well, they're not going to the temple. They're not following the calendar of their people. They're about as liberal, if you will, to use that term. They're the opposite side. Now, what's in the center? Just using simple words for the moment, leaving out radicals, just talking about conservative center and liberal. It seems to me that the Pharisees represent the liberal position, or if you prefer to say the most popular position, because that's what Josephus says, that most of the people follow the Pharisees, and it makes sense to me how they slide easily after the destruction of the temple from the Pharisees into the rabbis. So I think they represent the center. Now, if you read the New Testament, they're not fulminating against the Sadducees, except maybe in the temple in the last days of Jesus. They never even mention the Essenes, directly at least. The real fight seems to be, and the vituperation and the polemics and the political infighting seems to be with the Pharisees. And of course, they accuse them of exactly what I expect them to be, hypocrites in it for the money, of course. Now, if we had what the Pharisees were saying about the Messianic Christics, I'm sure it was just as bad. The difference is, of course, that the Messianic Christics eventually got political power. And therefore, they were able to take the rhetoric and say, we're coming to get you.
Yeah. Yeah. What I remember in some class in graduate school reading these kind of counter gospels where different narratives, say like Matthew or whatever, gets rewritten where there are different explanations. Like Jesus snuck into the Holy of Holy, wrote down the name of God, cut a hole in his thigh and closed it up and found it later. And that's how he did, all the wonders and such. That moment, is that, where does that show up historically, where you start to see these kind of like counter narratives?
Well, the great classic one is that Mary was raped. At least it was not her fault, by a Roman soldier. Therefore, of course, that sounds to me exactly like if somebody says virgin birth, like Matthew says, and I was opposing him, and okay, you don't know the father, or Joseph wasn't the father, then you're telling me she was raped. And of course, that's why Matthew bends over backwards in his first two chapters to show that Jesus is the Son of God and there was no rape involved or no prurient interest. And he makes Josephus doubt it for a moment so he can solve the whole thing. That's Matthew debating, counter debating even, with his, I don't know if you want to say his fellow Pharisees. I don't know if you want to think Matthew was a Pharisee, but at least his fellow scribes, his fellow learned people. So that's a great example where you can see it at work. And I think you can see it at work in the empty tomb debates where they said, oh, you guys chose the body. Imagine we couldn't have chosen the body because you put guards there. Well, the guards were asleep, so they missed, that's exactly what I would expect. And it's heavily in Matthew.
Yeah. You talk about how metaphors create reality, and there are two questions that came in about that. The first, David's, he said, you argue that metaphors create reality rather than simply describing it. How does this understanding of metaphor change our approach to ancient religious texts like Paul's?
Yeah, well, let me begin with it changes our way of handling what we're living in right now. Do we really think that a constitution, because it's a couple of 100 years old, is reality? A metaphor is only reality when it is lived out, and as it is lived out, for good or bad, by the way. Could be a disaster, but it's lived out. My examples, from the 30s are Roosevelt and Hitler. They're both metaphors. They're both lived out by people. One is a disaster, and as far as I'm concerned, the other one isn't, but that's... So you watch what happens. You wager your life and your sacred honor, if you will, on the metaphor. And if it is a bad metaphor, and that is not decided by you, by the way, bad metaphors are decided by evolution. Evolution takes care of bad metaphors, but it might take 100 years to do it. So be very, very careful. But we're experimenting now with autocracy. We thought that maybe democracy had arrived and it was kind of like gravity. All you had to do was be there, sort of. But now, oh no, we had to live out democracy and believe in it, or it wouldn't just happen. So now we're experimenting with autocracy. And the image behind me, I put up today, shows on one side Caesar Augustus as the high priest of Roman imperial victory. He's the divine victor. He's not even wearing shoes because, you know, he's a god. And on the other side, you have him as the high priest of Roman imperial theology. So you bring the two things together, and it's marvelous. Each is the same. This is what religion and politics looks like in the first century.
Yeah. David's Jennifer's follow-up question around metaphors. She said, you mentioned that humans create small metaphors, but large ones create us. Could you explain how this dynamic functions in Paul's thinking about resurrection and empire?
Okay, and I remember how we are living in a metaphor at the moment. We're living in somebody's projection of the future. It's now our present, and we thought it was forever. So let me take two examples. In the first century, I'm trying to understand words as they were understood in the first century, because that's always where I begin. So what's ascension? It's the wallpaper of the Mediterranean. It's taken for granted, Greeks, Romans, Jews, that certain very holy people for the Jews, very powerful people for the Romans, wouldn't just die, molder into dust. They'd be taken up to God. Now, whatever happened to their body, they mightn't worry too much. But their spirit, with a new body, of course, because otherwise he wouldn't recognize them. If Caesar Augustus appeared up in heaven with no body, everyone would say, who's he? Huh, we don't know spirits here. So, of course, you got a new body. That was taken for granted. But it was a very personal, private, individual privilege, mostly for males. If you look real hard, you might get a female in there. But mostly for males, mostly for elite males. Okay, granted, it could be even a sports figure, an Olympic hero, but it was individual. The resurrection. Resurrection was absolutely a totally different metaphor. It meant that there is cosmic justice in this world. This is the mantra of the Pharisees. There is a cosmic justice. Okay, it's only at the end of time, but then the whole world will publicly, forensically see the cosmic justice of God. Now, whether you believe in that or not, I would ask you to watch the evening news and decide if maybe evolution is running its own cosmic justice, or do we get away with it? I'm not talking about me or you or individual. I'm talking about us as a species. I want to know, do we as a species get away with what we're doing to the world? Do we have to wait till the end of time, or till we create the end of time to recognize it?
Yeah. Yeah. Robert asked a question. I think that follows up here quite well. He said, how does your understanding of resurrection and ascension as metaphors rather than literal descriptions change our interpretations of early Christian theology?
I think it changes it completely, because I think in Western Christian theology, we talk resurrection and mean ascension. That's my challenge. In Eastern Christian theology and iconography, they talk resurrection and they mean resurrection. That's why you see in Easter images, Christ is holding on to the hands of Adam and Eve. That's the human race. That's our species. It's put in the only way you can draw the whole human race in an image, the biblical image of Adam and Eve. They're not two guys from the Old Testament or two old people from the Old Testament. They are the human race. So how you interpret it, whether you're taking resurrection as it was intended, as Paul meant it, and knew all about it because he was a Pharisee, and took it over into his messianic Christic status, is going to change completely. and it's going to change Easter, and it's going to change human justice.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, what's interesting is how much of the early church, the Christological controversies were around the person of Jesus. How the humanity and divinity section, as opposed to the kind of work or what was accomplished. And it seems that if you're just debating like the person of Jesus, it's easy to flow back and forth and not see the importance of the resurrection ascension distinction. But if you're talking about the work of Jesus, what God did in Christ, the resurrection horizon has such a stronger continuity with what Paul thought was going on.
Yeah, Paul would be screaming at the idea that Jesus was ascended. We might think, "Oh, isn't that lovely? Then maybe we should obey him because he's up there watching us or something." But no, that's not the way Paul sees it. Paul thinks of the human race. We don't really.
Yeah. All right. Pat asks a question here that kind of picks up something that's been running through your lectures. Did Peter, James, and other Jewish-focused apostles grasp Paul's vision of universal resurrection? Were they aware his Gentile mission served a larger goal of cosmic justice through resurrection?
Honestly, Pat, I have my doubts. I'm not sure that's the answer to your question. I'm sure about Paul because he was a Pharisee, so he began with this even before he ever heard of Jesus. He was already committed to the cosmic justice of resurrection. I understand that was the pivot that made him able, without a psychic breakdown, to pivot from being a persecutor to being an apostle. It was like, oh, then if these guys are right that I'm persecuting, I'm right about the resurrection. So it was crucial for Paul. Now, when you're talking about anyone else, certainly, as we know from the agreement between Acts 15, Jerusalem Conference, Peter and James do accept that Gentile, let's say even God worshippers, God-fearers, can become full members of the people of God without circumcision for males. They do agree with that. So they're seeing something of Paul's vision. And even though Paul is very insulting about them in Galatians, he does admit we all agreed on that. No, there was no decree that male converts had to be circumcised. I mean, that's a crucial step. But the other side of it is they split the mission. The Jewish mission with, let's say, James in the mother church in Jerusalem, kind of Peter in charge of the Jewish mission, Barnabas and Paul in charge of the Gentile mission. I haven't a clue how that works except as a typical piece of administrative compromise. I haven't a clue how it could possibly work out in cities that have both Peter and Paul maybe there, like Antioch.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the Elizabeth had a question kind of following up around the nature of the resurrection and its ethical import. She asked, you contrast individual ascension with universal resurrection as competing metaphors of divine justice. Why was resurrection particularly appealing to marginal communities in the first century?
Well, if you understand the two metaphors, Elizabeth, how would I put it? The story of the metaphor of ascension was for very, 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 very few people among millions. Maybe they were great stories and maybe they gave you some kind of something to hold on to. I don't know. But they certainly were not for the great mass of people who were going right down the Sheol or Hades. So basically, at least this raises the issue, raises the issue. There might be cosmic justice. There might be something in this world, be it God or the gods, and the gods weren't big on cosmic justice. They weren't that big, to be honest with you, except as personal favors of any sort of justice. I mean, yes, they took care of their own, as you can see, sort of in the Trojan War, but they competed for favorites almost. So if there was any vision at all of a cosmic justice, however they were going to imagine it, that was the great achievement of the Pharisees. So I could see how ordinary people would much prefer. The others, what's in it for me? So what? Maybe you could argue, well, Augustus is up in heaven, so he's keeping the peace. Okay, big deal.
Yes. James has a question around, you told the story of the Maccabean martyrs in the lecture, and how it plays a crucial role in your explanation of resurrection belief kind of emerging in that time. How did their experience transform Jewish understanding of divine justice in the period leading up to Paul pre-destruction of the temple?
Okay, thank you, James. Here's the way I understand it. When you're reading through Torah, prophets, wisdom, you see basically Deuteronomic theology running everything. And Deuteronomic theology works with, if you obey the Lord your God, you'll be rewarded and blessed. If you disobey the Lord your God, you'll be punished and be disaster. It's quite clear. It's all spelled out, and it's here on earth. If you obey, your enemies will run before you 7 ways. If you disobey, you'll be running before your enemies. Okay, that's clear. Does it work? That's the only question. And of course, Job is the great book that says, no, it doesn't work. Whatever's going on, it ain't that. Now, imagine you're on Deuteronomic theology and you're facing the battered, executed, slaughtered bodies of martyrs. And God, according to Deuteronomy, says, you obey, I reward, you disobey, I punish. Along comes Antiochus IV Epiphanes in his faltering Syrian empire, with the Egyptians always coming north and threatening him, and the Romans coming east and threatening him even more. And he's trying to consolidate his whole little tottering empire. And he decides the real resistance is coming from those Jews to the south and their religion. Okay, I'll put an end to the religion. That'll solve it. So, if you obey the Lord your God, you will die. If you disobey the Lord your God, you will live. Now, where's the Deuteronomist? Clearly, God doesn't work like that. So the transition is from rewards and punishment in this life. Deuteronomy just moves into the next life. But that raises the issue. Is it still all individual? When I die, as it were, and the Maccabean martyrs die, are they taken up to God? So it's just a widening of the ascension matrix, as it were. No, they're insisting that there will be this global cleanup operation, that they're not just going to God as individuals on ascension. It actually is the whole invention of resurrection, as I understand the situation. I don't see it anywhere before that. You can read it in afterwards through Ezekiel's dry bones and other places. You might see it after you know about it. But the Deuteronomist runs in the Old Testament, basically, with the exceptions, the cases that don't work, like Manasseh and Josiah, and of course, Job, who puts an end to the Deuteronomist, should have. But in effect, he just becomes a speed bump on the highway. Job is ignored.
One of the things, both in James and Jennifer's question, when thinking about the big picture of Paul, that's helpful, is the picture of a universal resurrection emerges as a concept and then is applied to Jesus for out of a Jewish faith that insists there's one good God of creation, despite the protest and evidence against it in history. It's like, what is the nature of a faith that affirms a good God and just God of creation and is a realist about what's going on in the world? It takes something of significance like the resurrection to give a response.
Yeah, minimally, unless you're going to lose faith in this God and say maybe it's a particularly nasty God with a nasty sense of humor. If you're going to hold on to your experience on the Levantine coast, which is that you're the footpath of empire, they're coming through you, if not coming at you, and your God is just and running the world, and the world is unjust, then that cognitive dissonance will first of all make you say, well, somewhere, sometime, days to come, there'll be a great cleanup of the world. And then as the world tends to get worse and worse, because empires ain't getting weaker, they're getting stronger, then the imperative becomes more and more. How does this actually work? And you can see that happening. Now, resurrection, of course, if you're thinking, well, it's going to happen soon, well, then yes. But Paul's answer, of course, is not just it's going to happen soon. It has already started with Jesus. Otherwise, Paul would simply be one more person saying, well, at the end of time, there'll be a great cleanup. And we all recognize that today, by the way. There may be an end of time made by us, not by God. Nothing to do with God. We're working hard on bringing time to a conclusion. So, yes, but that's not very consoling. So what do you do right now? Watch yourself destroying the world. So at least Paul says, no, something has happened. There is a new creation. A new creation. That's big stuff, as we said, with the radical. And so Paul is imagining, what if it has started with Jesus? What if the injustice of Jesus's execution revealed what God is up to? That's really what he's seeing. The revelation. It's not that God suddenly, thought some afternoon in the 30s, yeah, I think I'll try this. No, that would be absurd. From all eternity, God knew a revelation would break through. As Emily Dickinson says, revelation, 'tis not that awaits but our unfurnished eyes. I think something like that. Revelation is there. You got to just see it. It's not it suddenly appeared. It was suddenly noticed at a certain time. So I'm putting a lot of emphasis then on the execution, resurrection of Jesus for Paul as an inseparable dyad, like two sides of a coin. You can certainly look at one or the other, but you cannot know one without the other.
Yeah, and that the lecture for next week on the mystery of God will kind of dig into even more of that.
Yeah, and they were talking about not as the kind of redundant expression, the mystery of God. No, the mystery of not what God is, but what God did. That's what Paul's talking about.
Yeah. All right. Linda asks, you suggest that Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:20 indicates a general resurrection has already begun. How does this claim transform traditional apocalyptic expectations?
It depends, Linda. If you say to yourself, well, the end's coming soon in any case, then it makes almost no difference. So you could read Paul and say, okay, we accept it all, but it'll all be over within our lifetime, as I think Paul expected. Paul keeps using we all the way into Romans even. So I think Paul expected this to be over in his lifetime. Okay, the good thing is he didn't say it all depends on it being over. This is all sort of emergency operations. We all believe in all of this stuff only because it's coming. Get ready for the hurricane, as it were. It's an emergency situation. No, that's not what Paul says. This was God's vision from all eternity. So I think it really, I don't know, what do I say? It upends apocalyptic execution. It makes it just not something, it's off in the future and yeah. It's great for scaring kids and scaring the horses or whatever. But, nobody takes it seriously because it's off in the future. I think, if Paul was here today and we said, now, excuse me, Paul, you do know that this is running for at least 2,000 years and counting. So what do you see different now, Paul? I have a feeling Paul wouldn't say anything except, well, I was wrong about the time, but I wasn't wrong about the vision. And I would think, looking at him today, I would say, yep, I do see the vision, not as a religious thing even. I see it as an evolutionary necessity. And yeah, we've always been wrong about the time because we want it over. And what always happens is not it's over, but something else happens.
Yeah. Let's see. Daniel asks, what misunderstanding might arise from contemporary Christian interpreting resurrection through modern individualistic frameworks rather than through a lens of cosmic justice?
Oh, well, I'm going to say, Daniel, you just gut Paul like a fish. And as long as you're at it, I don't mean you, but if one takes that, you do the same to Jesus, because Jesus is talking about what would the world be like if God was sitting on Caesar's throne, which would be a little crowded since Caesar thought he was God and sitting on the throne of the world. So they're both asking the same thing. It's as if you were to ask today, because kingdom of God, reign of God, rule of God, I think goes right over most people's heads. What would the federal budget look like if God drew it up? The biblical God. Let's not imagine God exists or anything else. Just the profile you have of the biblical God in the Bible, supposing that God was drawing up the federal budget. How do you think it would look like? Or if God wanted to appoint somebody to run the federal government, the federal budget, would we think God would choose the richest person in the earth just by reading the Bible? Is that what we expect God to do, or who would God appoint to be the legislature to run God's world?
Yeah, yeah. I think that we'll at least not be like defunding AIDS medicine in poverty-stricken areas of the globe.
I mean, I have to say this. The Bible does say, cursed are the rich. There is an expression in the Bible, cursed are the rich. So the more rich I would be, the more careful I would be. That's all I will say about it. It doesn't say blessed. It never says blessed are the rich. It does say cursed are the rich. That's Luke, by the way.
Yeah. Joseph has a question about, and this is a longer question, so I had to come up with a short version, where he was talking about Josephus and Paul sharing this Pharisaic background, and yet Josephus claims God gave world power to Rome and messianic authority to Vespasian. How would Paul have responded to these assertions? Like what kind of outline or talking points is Paul coming into a conversation with a fellow Pharisee who just appears to be diametrically opposed?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing, on presumption it isn't a loud cosmic scream, I think he would ask him, could you show me that in the Torah? Could you show me that in the prophets who beat their swords at the plow? Where are you getting this, dear Josephus? Now, let me be fair. What terrifies Josephus, and it's not a false terror, it is this. After the Great War of 66 to 73, Rome took all the money that used to go to the temple and sent it to the temple of Jerusalem, to the temple of Rome of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, and it taxed every single Jewish person, not just the males, the fiscus Judaicus. So I think what terrifies Josephus, to make him know what he ticks, is what if Rome decides, and it's not a stupid decision, that it's our religion really that opposes them? That's why we had the war of 4 BC, using our dates, and this war of 66 to 73. Josephus doesn't know there's two more coming in 115 and 132. Maybe Rome is going to see, okay, this is as bad as the Celts. It's their religion is the problem. We'll put an end to this once and for all. Circumcision of male infants is forbidden under pain of death. Now, we're not talking about discrimination. We're talking about genocide. If you're a Jew, we're going to kill you. So stop being a Jew. That terrifies, I think, Josephus. That's the only way I can understand how he comes up with what he says, the three great things. God has given power to the Romans. Okay, I could see that. God, he could argue that, but it's not Daniel very well. Roman power has been given to the Flavians. Okay, well, they're running the world. But what really is unforgivable, that it was all a mistake about the Messiah. We thought he would come of Israel, and he was only coming from Israel. Vespasian happened to be there with the legions, and if you're commanding the legions when there's a change of government, it does help to have the legions acclaim you emperor. So that's how Vespasian got in. But yeah, I mean, it's inexcusable. And he's doing this as the patron, the Flavian patron, defending Romans to Jews. And the only thing that makes one forgive Josephus a little bit is then he writes the Jewish antiquities defending Jews to Romans and Greeks. But I mean, do we say betrayer or quizzing or what?
Yeah, in Joseph's longer email, he asked if Josephus had artificial intelligence, do you think you'd have made a really cool video with a golden statue of Vespian right outside the temple gate? And
Well, look, during the Middle Ages, Christians, it was only Christians, by the way, who preserved Josephus. Once the rabbis withdrew actually from getting involved in this and knew how dangerous it had been for the destruction of their people, and they took holiness into the home and the synagogue and let world affairs take care of themselves. Josephus was not preserved. If it was up to the Jewish people, we would know Josephus. He was preserved by people in the Middle Ages who put in images. A lot of the images were tendentious. But if you go to all the Middle Ages, the Latin translations, the French translations, a lot of them are on the web, by the way, especially from Paris, France library, you can see them drawing these images. And it's fascinating because you can watch them showing Vespasian on a horse. It's medieval, of course. But they illustrate this stuff so you can see how they're thinking. And it also means, of course, that they're a bit slow to really change Josephus, because they're using Josephus to support the New Testament. And they're using Jewish antiquities to support their Old Testament. So they're relatively faithful. They're not just changing Josephus all around, because that destroys their whole argument at sea. Even the Jews agrees with us, as it were.
Yeah. William actually asked a question following up there about Josephus. He said, you suggest Josephus feared Rome might forbid Judaism entirely. How did this existential fear shape his writing, and how should we adjust our reading accordingly?
Well, the marvelous thing, William, about Josephus is that there's an overlap between his Jewish war written in the 70s, very close to the Flavians, and his Jewish antiquities written in the 90s, when he's a lot more independent. And you can kind of watch him doing it. For example, when he's talking about the fourth philosophy, you don't hear anything about the fourth philosophy in the Jewish war. It suddenly arises in the Jewish antiquities. But you can tell it's almost like he's going back to his sources, which are pruned carefully and censored carefully for the Jewish war. And then he goes back to them and uses them in the Jewish antiquities. So you can compare them. That's the first critical way you should read Josephus. The second one is we have the Bible, and we watch him rewriting the Bible in Jewish antiquities, and whatever about different changes in the Bibles, you can really see him rewriting Daniel. Go to, I think, it's Jewish Antiquities 10th volume, and watch him rewriting the book of Daniel. And he's great up to chapter 7. Oh, chapter 7, he's really scared, because after all, God judges all empires. Doesn't that mean the Roman Empire? And watch him dance around it in chapter 7 before he picks up 8 to 12. So you can watch Josephus at work. You can learn to read him critically, not just at random, with those two main tactics.
Yeah. You mentioned there the way the fourth philosophy shows up in the later edition or later text. And Karen asked about this. She said, you suggest that organized nonviolent resistance was invented in first century Judaism. What evidence supports the claim, and how does it challenge conventional understandings of political resistance in antiquity?
All right. First of all, Karen, insofar as I'm right about this, it's straight out of Josephus. You have to read Josephus, first of all, against that general background of any opposition to Rome is against God. Okay, now that's the whole matrix we're dealing with. But the one thing he can't really figure out, he understands violent resistance. And people do that. They shouldn't do it, but that's the way people do it with empires. But this non-violent resistance, he doesn't even admit, he dismisses it in the Jewish war by saying it's this sophist, this Judas. He's not even a philosopher, he's a sophist. The Romans use the word sophist the way we might disparagingly use the word lawyer. It's just somebody they'll give you whatever philosophy you want, just pay him. So he's not a philosopher, he dismisses it. Then in the same writing, when he's writing about the same thing, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all of a sudden we have a fourth philosophy, which he says is new, but then he kind of admits it's in our tradition. He's trying to handle nonviolent resistance, and he gives us the examples. Josephus and Philo tell us the story about good old Caligula trying to get the Syrian legate Petronius to take two legions, that's about 10,000 troops and all the auxiliaries, with his statue and put it up in the Temple of Jerusalem. The year is around 40, and it would have brought the Jewish War of 66 in the year 40. So you can read all that. It's not hidden. It's just there. And Josephus is appalled by it. He says these are villains with, how do you put it, with no blood on their hands, but more impure souls. He has to admit there's no blood in their hands. They ain't killers. But they're nonviolent resistance. How do you handle that? And he gives us all the examples. They're all there. All you got to do is say, wait a minute, I don't find it anywhere before Josephus, and I find it in Josephus. I think he invented it. It wasn't invented by Daniel O'Connell or Gandhi or Tolstoy or Martin Luther King. It's been there at least in Josephus. And in fact, he talks about three people we know from the New Testament: John the Baptist, leaving Jesus as well, Judas, and the Egyptian, the people he evidences as examples we know from the New Testament.
Yeah. Thomas actually asks about the Caligula crisis of 40 that features prominently in the lecture. How does this episode illuminate the strategy and theological foundations of nonviolent resistance?
All right, it's backed up by martyrdom, Thomas. That seems to be the main thing. And when Josephus is describing it, he really has trouble describing it for his Greek audience. He's talking about an invention, as I see it. The Greeks would have thought this is radically absurd. War is the glory of the human race. They pretty much said it's the business of the human race. So nonviolent resistance, he doesn't have the language for it. So you can read him very carefully. Jewish antiquities trying to grope for language. They're kind of willing to do, and they don't shrink from bloodshed. That's themselves. And I can't describe what sufferings they're willing to accept because you wouldn't believe it. Yeah, they're willing to die. But read the stories of Josephus. Now, he's against it. So I take as very precious evidence, especially Caligula, because I've got Philo to back him up, actually. So we have Philo and Josephus both telling the story of Caligula's statue and the huge numbers, men, women, and children, because you don't approach a legionary camp with men. If you bring your women and children, it's very dangerous, but at least they'll know you're not coming to attack. So all of that is there. And I really a little bit surprised that Jewish scholars and Christian scholars don't take it seriously. Jesus did not invent nonviolence, nor did John the Baptist. It was part of the matrix of operations. But it happened between the war of 4 BCE and 66, in the 70 years between the wars, when it was maybe possibly to use some other method of opposing Rome, nonviolent, and to save the people from what's going to happen, the slaughters of 66 to 73.
Yeah. Do you, thinking of all the different groups or instances that would fit, Josephus would have been like, oh, that's fourth philosophy. Are there common kind of religious or faith or theological commitments that run across them that kind of function as the engine of sorts to practice resistance nonviolently?
Yeah, and here's we're kind of groping our way. We do have evidence for Jesus, and I am not saying that he's the only one, but we do have evidence, because his argument is that we practice nonviolent resistance because that's the way God handles God's enemies. Oops. That's what we call the Sermon on the Mount. So God sends the sun and the rain to the good and the bad, where everyone knows that what God should send and the bad is the downpour or the deluge or whatever. So God operates with nonviolent resistance. Well, that's not exactly a mainstream view in the Bible. It really isn't. So we know his. Now, when I'm trying to understand, say, the people who marched up to Ptolemais against the legions with Petronius, and thank God Petronius was a decent leader and knew exactly what was going to happen, and thought that Caligula was nuts, but you have to be very careful telling the emperor you're nuts. He's stalling like mad and certainly endangering his own life. But he knows exactly this is really very, very dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. What if the emperor finally, as he does, tells me to go commit suicide for disobeying orders? And it's only the good luck that the boat, as Josephus says, arrives later. So what's the theology? Is it the same as Jesus? That we don't think God is working with violent resistance? Is the experience of 4. And in 4 BCE, when the Romans took over the south, their taxation and all the rest of it, they had a violent rebellion. In 6, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. In 4 BCE, when Archelaus took over and the sons of Herod took over the whole country, there was a rebellion in the south in 4 BCE. A violent rebellion, 2,000 people were crucified in Jerusalem. Now, in 6 CE, when the taxation came in with the Romans taking over from Archelaus, direct control, as far as I can see, that's a non-violent. So you got 2 models, 4 BC and 6. And now you have 60 years almost to think about it. And even a priori, I would say if nobody in those 70 years was saying, are we really preparing for another war? Do we think there'll be another war? What'll happen if there's another war? If anyone's thinking, that's always a danger. People might start thinking. They should be thinking this. So I'm not surprised when I see it. I'm sure there's people saying, well, we learned something from that one the next time. Or we take the opportunity when Nero dies. There's all sorts of options. I'm simply saying one of the options, not the dominant one. I don't know that. And I have to sort of grope my way to what theology. I know they're ready for martyrdom. Did they think that God would intervene at the last minute? Or was it like the Maccabees? They knew they would be rewarded by God in the next life. But one way or the other, it is an alternative to warfare. And of course, the people who wanted warfare could talk about Joshua. They had their arguments too.
Yeah. Emily's question kind of connects here. She talks about you connecting Jesus' command to love your enemies with nonviolent resistance historically. How does this interpretation differ from common understandings of this teaching?
Okay, Emily, I don't know if there are any common understandings of this teaching. I think what most of us want to do is say it and move on as fast as we can. Love your enemies. Why on earth? It's plural, by the way. It's plural. It's addressed to plurality and plural enemies. Why on earth would God or anyone who wants to say that, why wouldn't he simply say love everyone? Why specify enemies? I mean, you're not supposed to love your friends. I mean, Leviticus at least says, love your neighbor as yourself and love the resident alien as yourself. And we haven't even been able to do that, as you well know. We're not good on resident aliens. So why does Jesus say, love your enemies? Why doesn't he simply say, love everyone? Now, the only way I can understand it, because I'm trying to understand it, and why when he says it, everyone does, is that this is Jesus's way of advocating nonviolent resistance. Because you don't love somebody who's doing something evil and wrong by saying, go right ahead. No, you don't. In every way you can, be it mentally, refusing to believe what they're saying, rhetorically, refusing to agree with what they're saying, or if you want to and can do demonstrations, and yes, demonstrations were possible in the first century, you do what you can at least to oppose. That is how you love your enemies. Now, if you say, well, why did Jesus expect there to be enemies? mean, do we really think that somebody who's serious about God's rule on earth, or who's serious about general resurrection or a new creation, do we really think that the old creation will go quietly into that good night and say, oh, we're very sorry, we didn't think of that, we'll just go along with it? Of course not. If this is your vision, then you will have enemies. I do not know whether they will oppose you by ridicule, by simply laughing at you, or they will persecute you, or they will kill you. But there will be enemies if this is your vision. Now, if you don't take it seriously, of course, and it's all just nice talk, let's love your enemies and talk about all this lovely stuff. But it's kind of like, all people, let me say, are created equal. Let's say it, but we don't mean it. So there's no problem. And let's have a list of rights called the Constitution, but nobody is allowed to ask, what is the right for rights? How do you have a right to rights? We have this right, you have this right, and you have this right. But I want to ask another question, a kind of appalling question. How do you have a right to any rights at all, let alone these ones? These are the questions that are latent behind love your enemies. If you think Paul's and Jesus, I'm saying the same thing, different language. If you think they're to be taken seriously, if they're not, then it's like the Pledge of Allegiance. You could have the kids say liberty and justice for all, and nobody get excited about it because we don't believe it. And the kids are not going to come home and say, hey, when would this liberty and justice for all start? We know it's just talk. So the Bible, I think, as far as I can see, isn't just talk. They're actually trying to do it. That's why there's so much opposition to the Bible in the Bible.
Yeah. Andrew asks a question here that's, I think, a clarifying one about the relationship between Pharisaic beliefs about resurrection and the practice of nonviolent resistance. How might this connection have influenced Paul's thinking? In the longer version, thinking about how it shows up in Jesus' teaching and in his own journey to the cross, and then how that helped him interpret the resurrection event to have like this kind of continuity, both of eschatological vision and a continuity of nonviolent resistance.
Yeah, and this is really a huge question for me. There's a huge questions at the end of my book that I think are questions for the future. It doesn't mean I'm not groping my way towards them and have something to say about them, but this is serious unfinished business. I want to know, is it just coincidence that we find, obviously, resurrection is like the ground zero for the Pharisees. This is what makes them them. They can talk about being faithful to tradition. And actually, of course, they're not being faithful to tradition. They're inventing it as fast as they can. But is there some connection in the Pharisaic mind between nonviolent resistance and resurrection? If you believe in one, do you believe in both? Or is it just two discrete things? In other words, if there is a cosmic justice, and in their understanding, it is the control of God, is that why we can leave violence to God, as it were, or as Jesus would say, not even to God? So I would like to raise the question of how did the Pharisaic vision and imagination hold these two things? Because at least when Josephus is talking about finally talking about the fourth philosophy, he says these guys agree in everything, except, of course, this weird fourth philosophy, with the Pharisees. Okay, that sounds to me like he's trying to say these guys are a group of Pharisees, or they're what would I call it? A part of the Pharisees. But he certainly connects them, because the Pharisee is named in the fourth philosophy. So this is all hugely unfinished business if we start to try and understand nonviolent resistance in Josephus. If we don't do that, then you can skip all this stuff.
Well, it seems that thinking of Jesus in his own context, how his kind of fidelity to the one he calls Abba, the kingdom of God, this kind of thing, all the way to the cross, right? Like not avoiding arrest and everything that we talked about last year. That if Paul goes around going, let the same mind be in y'all that was in Christ Jesus, who didn't, this kind of like fidelity, kenosis, and then going like, oh, share in the sufferings of Christ, and we are the body of Christ. It seems that there's that kind of participatory element is a recapitulation of Jesus' own invitation to the disciples to participate in the coming of the kingdom.
Yeah, and I am presuming what we said last year. I'm really presuming that Jesus, from his actions, did not go up to Jerusalem to get himself martyred any more than those people who marched up to the camp of Petronius at Ptolemais wanted to get martyred. They shouldn't. You should never want to be a martyr because you need a murderer to service you. So no, but you can be aware. And anyone who's doing dangerous stuff like Martin Luther King was doing knows the possibility of martyrdom. That's not the same as let's go there because it's guaranteed. You might even say, let's not go there because it might be guaranteed. So what we can see that Jesus, protected by the crowd during the day and going off to Bethany every night, is doing everything he can not to get himself executed, and almost makes it, as according to Mark 14:1. So, but the danger, and that is the danger of nonviolent resistance, because nonviolent resistance is what we would call activism or demonstrations, and what the Romans called in their civil law stirring up the people. Now, that's not violent resistance. If you're violent, we kill you. Do we need a trial? Of course not. That's what you have the jus ladi, the right of the sword, for. You're a rebel with your guys. We caught you. You're dead. Now, how did the Romans handle nonviolent resistance? We know they call that stirring up the people or creating a tumult. That's, for example, Ignatius of Antioch would be probably in that category. So might John of Patmos. The Romans said, we crucify you, we send you to the beasts, and we send you to an island if you have strong support or a little bit important. That's how they handled nonviolent resistance. They didn't bother rounding up all your followers. You're nonviolent, so we crucify this as a warning, and your followers will get it. And if they don't, if they're still around 5 years from now, we'll do it all over to your new leader. We don't waste iron nails and train torturers on nonviolent people to gather all their supports. We'll do that with violent ones. Crucify them all in a nice row up there. We don't waste it on nonviolent, but we do crucify the leader. So if you only had Josephus again, who says, not in the famous statement, but in the other statement where he's talking about James, he calls him the Christ. And he talks about him being executed, crucified, but he never says anything about there's 12 crosses up there because we got all his leaders too, all his lieutenants too. So if I only had Josephus, I'd know there was a guy who started this movement over there. We crucified him. We didn't round up his followers. It's not, so therefore I know he's nonviolent. We have a huge amount from Josephus. We just have to read him critically and carefully, like we read Luke.
Yeah. All right. Next question here from Michelle. If Paul inherited both Pharisaic resurrection belief and nonviolent resistant traditions, how does this relationship or reshape our understanding of his critiques of both Judaism and Paul?
Okay, Michelle, we kind of touched on that in the last one because that's unfinished business. We have to try and figure out how they come together in general. But for Paul, there is one difference between Paul. It raises this issue of what we call Acts 13. Okay? Doesn't it say there that we must obey the rulers and all the rest of it? I've gone backwards and forwards in that, honestly. And it doesn't bother me if Paul wrote it, that I'm sorry to put it bluntly, it's the stupidest thing he ever wrote, or pretty much anyone else ever wrote in human history. You do not give a blank check to an oligarch or a dictator. You just don't do it. You might give a reluctant payment to them if you're forced to it, but you don't give them a blank check. So to say that whatever the leaders do is backed by God is just stupid. And Paul wasn't stupid. So my choice is, this is either an insertion into that letter, or it is, I'm sorry, the most stupid thing Paul would ever have said. And it's not a question of taxation. I'm convinced if people said to Paul, should we pay tax? He said, of course, we're not going to die for taxes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the one of the things that comes up from a number of people, and I just picked Christopher's because there were like multiple variations of this, is how might Paul's vision of nonviolent resistance to empire speak to contemporary global challenges and conflicts? And in many ways, that's what we've been doing, is pointing out just that what happens within Paul in his own historical context by contrasting him in each of these sessions and places. But when you start to take this vision and put it in the larger story of evolution, are there particular things that come to mind about how this kind of vision speaks into the present?
Oh, yes, Christopher, there are. And I'm again groping my way. I have resisted consistently ever using the term nonviolent for Jesus or Paul. It is always nonviolent resistance I'm talking about. Now, I am not a pacifist myself because I probably don't have the courage for it. I admire, admittedly from a safe distance, anyone who, as a witness to the possibility of non-violent resistance, is ready to die rather than use violence. I'm not ready to do that, and I won't say it when I'm not, and I don't think we are either, no matter what we say, because I think if you see somebody beating a child to death and the only thing you have is a baseball bat, I think I would use it. And if I didn't, I think I would be a coward. That's where I am. So I'm not nonviolent. And that means that if Russia attacks Ukraine, to make it very specific, do they have a right to defend themselves? And the answer is yes. And in any case, will they do it? And the answer is yes again. Because I don't know how you make a decision to let a nation be martyred. You may make that decision for yourself. And I'm not certain you should make it if you have other obligations to a family or to children. That's a question I'd like to talk with Thomas Moore sometime. However, I'm raising an evolutionary question, to put a crude distinction, not an ethical question, though of course it is ethical because it's evolutionary. How is the human race going to become a sustainable race? And there's no other race besides the human race, by the way. Black race, white race, all of that's rubbish. There's only one race. There may be difference in tincture and in history that create big differences, but big oppressions, but there's only one race, Homo sapiens. And our crisis is, and it's been there from the beginning, whether we've released it or not, are we a sustainable species? Or are we glorious and magnificent, but somewhat like the saber-toothed tiger was? We're just also doomed by ourselves. That's really the question I'm raising. So it's the evolutionary question. Can we get control of, hyphenated now, escalatory violence? That's the trajectory. I'm not doing prophecy, I'm doing trajectory. We have never had a weapon we didn't use. We never had a weapon that wasn't more violent than the preceding one. So if I look at the trajectory of human history, I do not see how our violence, now we know it's violence against the world in any case. So we have, even if we had the most peaceful world you could imagine, and all the swords were beaten into plowshares and everything was perfect, we could still destroy the world. We worked out 2 backup systems for weapons of mass destruction. The world itself, or other species. We have a triple 3-front onslaught on our world, any one of which would be enough to raise the question of sustainability. That is an evolutionary question. I do not have an answer to it unless we want to accept that it is and try and start slowly before it's too late to remedy it. Otherwise, what is up for discussion is our sustainability as a species.
Mhm. Yeah. All right. We'll see how many more of these questions we can get in quickly here, Dom.
Right.
Jan asks, what's the distinction between Caesar Augustus' divine status while alive and his desire to be declared divine by the Senate after his death? Is it that he was only son of God versus a god?
No, it's not that last one at all. It really is that Horace says in his own poetry that what's really, really weird about Augustus is he says we usually wait till people are dead because we're jealous. So we don't wait till they're dead. Then we have altars and all the rest of it. But Augustus is a divine even when he's alive. So that's the first thing. But, what Augustus really wants is to be certified by the Senate. It's like if your election isn't certified somehow, you're not son of God by those Greeks. Well, they have lots of sons of God, so Augustus might have been our God or whatever else, but that the Senate would declare him divine. That's at least it's not original with me, by the way. That's the best explanation I've ever got for the res geste. That's what he's up against. Dear senators, anyone going into my tomb, look at what I did. It's not even his will and testament. It's a special thing. Now, get your senators to vote to vote for me, as it were. So it's his curriculum vitae for immortal divinity by the Senate. But he's already Son of God, the revelation of a God. I mean, it honestly, people, it floors me that people kind of get surprised when people say Jesus is Son of God, Redeemer, Lord. If you're really serious about his status in the world, what other language do you have? If somebody wanted to be running this country, he has to be the president. If somebody said, I'd really like to be the facilitator in chief, that's not going to work. You're stuck with president. You can't say, well, I don't like to preside. I just like to persuade. This is the language you have to go for. You're stuck with God, Son of God, and all the rest of it. And by the way, if Muhammad had been living in the first century, those would have been his titles, or we wouldn't be talking about Islam today.
Mm-hmm. All right. Lisa asked, how would you characterize the transformative Christ experience of Paul, Peter, Mary Magdalene? Was it merely mental? What made Paul's message so compelling to the masses? And this was a long question looking at different ways these kind of christophanies are described and then what kind of authority they legitimate in different texts.
Okay. Lisa, I get a little bit nervous with purely mental. Again, purely mental would be a metaphor that nobody lives by. If let's imagine, for example, I think what Paul, just talking about Paul for a moment, what Paul saw was the crucified, glorified Jesus. The crucified, glorified Jesus. If it was a vision, I'm going to push it a bit. If there was a vision, the wounds were still there. Now, that's what he has, that's his vision. But you have to interpret the vision. You could say, well, that's interesting, good for Jesus, or he deserves it. You have to interpret the vision. That's where resurrection comes up and ascension comes up and all the rest of it. So these visions depend on what you mean by it. Now, I think there is a certain amount between Paul, Peter, and Mary Magdalene going on with who saw him first? Oh, I saw him first. Because obviously see that between Paul and Peter clearly, kind of who's in charge. And Paul is insisting, I saw the Lord. Peter, you saw the Lord. Okay, you walked around Galilee with him, but we don't mind even if we saw him in the flesh. He has to dismiss that because that's one up for Peter and Mary Magdalene. But then you see Peter and Mary Magdalene, who got there first. And what you have in John's Gospel, chapter 20, is a denigration of Mary Magdalene. She can't get it. She keeps thinking it's the gardener. That's not a compliment. That's taking that she was first. How do we play it down? How do we get Peter first? Well, The beloved disciple is putting Peter down. The beloved disciple in John 20 is also putting Mary down. But if he's putting Peter and Mary down, that believes that they are up with him. You don't bother attacking somebody who's not your peer in this case. So I think all of them are dealing with visions, and a vision is not an hallucination. If you've had an hallucination, you don't know you've had an hallucination. That's what makes A Perfect Mind such a marvelous book and movie, if you want to use that term for something that's really sad. Because you had an hallucination, that's reality. If you've had a vision, you know you've had a vision, and it's up to you then what it means, how to interpret it, what you're going to do about it, or whether you just say, nice for Jesus.
Yeah. All right. Okay, this one's a very quick one. Tom wants to know if you have a map recommendation, preferably topographic, showing Paul's missionary travels.
No, and if I had one, I wouldn't show it to you. Paul, the idea of the triple travel, this is Luke. And with all due respect to Sir William Ramsay, he's not Paul, the Roman citizen and the traveler. Paul's strategy is to hit capital cities in general. It's not the travel like a Methodist missionary. He's not traveling all the time. He's trying to get somewhere. Look at where he is. He's operating out of Thessaloniki, or capital of Macedonia, Corinth, capital of Achaia, Ephesus of Asia. He's a capitalist, if you allow me to say that. His strategy is hit the capitals, hit the God worshippers, move on. The rest will take it up. He's not a traveling one, hitting all the small little towns. Barnabas and Paul tried that, I think, in Cyprus and in Anatolia, and Paul figured out this is crazy. There's thousands of little towns around. So I don't think those travels help us. And besides it, they don't even mention the first one, the Arabian mission, probably because it was a dismal failure, but it should be there. So I don't trust I don't trust Luke's nice encapsulation. And here's where you can see it. Luke sends him across the Aegean Sea from Alexandria, Troas, over to Philippi. Oh, good. He's going all the way to Rome. Good. We're going from Jerusalem to Rome, like Jesus said. He's on the road. And all of a sudden, he loops down, goes all the way down to Athens. Wait a minute. How do you get to Rome through Athens? And then he's over at Ephesus. So Luke's knows topography. He certainly knows, but he wants to get him from Jerusalem to Rome. And unfortunately, that's not quite what Paul is doing. He finally does get to Rome and wants to go to Rome when he writes to the Romans, but that's late in the game. That's when he's finished with the East. So, and he goes there, of course, as a prisoner. So I don't find Paul's lovely topography, and I'm not prejudiced because honestly, I've been in all of those places. I've looked at all of them, and I'd love to be able to say, see, I've been to all the places. Everywhere Paul went, yeah. There's a temptation to insist on the validity of where he went. No, I don't think Luke is helpful on the journeys of Paul at all.
All right, last question. This one came in on the chat from Glenn. Would people like Peter and James have to be Essenes, Pharisees, or Sadducees, or could they live outside those labels?
Honestly, I don't know about the name, but let me talk about James for a moment. I am convinced that James, when he talks about the poor, that's capital T, capital P, is running in Essene-like community of shared goods. I don't think of celibate like down in Qumran, but I think he's running the second type of Essene groups that Josephus talks about, who marry but do share at least maybe tithes or something like that with a community. I think James has I'm going to call it a share community instead of the normalcy of a greed community in Jerusalem. That's James's power. It's not that he's out there with Peter or with Paul or anything. You call it the mother church if you want, call it the ideal community. That's why he's so important. And up to the year 62, he's only put to death by 62 by, again, a Sadducean descendant of good old Caiaphas and the rest of them. He's put to death, and that topples the Sadducean high priest. who would have sympathized with him? It had to be the Pharisees, who was powerful enough to topple a high priest. I think James is very much the ascetic who is running an ascetic share community. I don't know if everyone else has been an ascetic, but if you're an ascetic, you're kosher. It's hard to think of a person living an ascetic life who isn't de facto kosher, as it were, unless they're trying to be. So I think James is really the mother church, and that's what the collection is all about. That's what trying to seal the division between the two missions. That's why it's so important for Paul to take the collection himself, not in his own pocket, as it were, but with his group, and to go to Jerusalem and to go to James. They're trying to heal the breach so that the split mission doesn't become a split vision.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dom. That was a whole bunch of questions we went through right there.
Listen, Trip, I just noticed something. I made up that image behind me, and just at the last minute when I was waiting to come on with you, and I think I put the wrong titles on each one. It should be the High Priest of Roman Imperial. It should be over on when he's ready for sacrifice, and the Divine Agent of Roman Imperial Victory. But mix and match. Each of them equals the other. I made them in a hurry. That's what imperial religiopolitics looks like. He's a dual autocrat, as it were.
There you go. Well, thank you all for sending in great questions. We'll be doing it again next week at a normal time on Thursday. I'm chaperoning a 5th grade field trip tomorrow, so we moved early. And anyone that's been that hasn't got lectures yet, you can head over to crossanclass.com and join up and send in your questions for next week. So with that, we'll say goodbye.